Greetings, cozy knights. Lower your swords and rest by the fire. Tonight, we journey through the deepest, darkest, most stubbornly unanswered mysteries that Yharnam has ever kept from us. Drop a comment below and tell me where you're listening from tonight and what games you want me to cover next, and subscribe if this helps you sleep. What is pale blood, really? The very first line spoken in Bloodborne is a response to a question the player never hears. The Blood Minister leans in close, his lantern flickering in that cold stone room, and says, "Oh yes, pale blood. Well, you've come to the right place. You woke up looking for something, but the game never tells you what it is. A note in the room where your character first opens their eyes says only, 'Seek pale blood to transcend the hunt.' That is all. 5 syllables pointing at a void. Pale blood is mentioned only 5 times across the entire game, and each time, the word means something slightly different, or nothing at all. Gilbert, the coughing man behind the window in Cathedral Ward, has never heard of it. A note in the Nightmare Lecture Building calls it the nameless moon presence beckoned by Lawrence and his associates. Director Hidetaka Miyazaki himself, when pressed in an interview, murmured that it could be another name for the monster that comes from the moon, but then acknowledged there is more than one interpretation. The sky after Rom's death turns pale as a drained body, and one reading suggests that pale blood is that color itself, the color of the world when the barriers between man and cosmos begin to dissolve. The most celebrated theory from a fan analysis called the Pale Blood Hunt argues that your hunter suffers from hypochromic anemia, literally pale blood, and that this bloodlessness is what makes you resistant to the beastly corruption corroding everyone else in Yharnam. Another reading connects pale blood to the Plain Doll herself, who is said to bleed white. Whatever it is, the word functions almost as the game's thesis statement. You arrived here seeking something, and Yharnam has given you everything, except the answer. The hunter's true identity. You create your character before the game begins, but the foreign garb you wear when you wake up carries a description that says it is not typical clothing for Yharnam. Perhaps it is of foreign origin. It is said the traveler came to Yharnam from afar. Without memory, who will ever know? Without memory. The game strips your past away as a design choice, but that erasure raises its own question. The Blood Minister says all signed and sealed after administering your transfusion, implying a contract was made, and given in exchange for what? One reading suggests the moon presence orchestrated your arrival from the beginning, drawing you to Yharnam precisely because you were someone capable of ascending to Great One status. Your origins, your ailment, your name. The game never reveals any of it, and in the Japanese version of the game, the note telling you to seek pale blood was apparently written by the hunter themselves, meaning your character somehow left themselves a message before losing memory. The implications are staggering and wholly unexplained. Why Gehrman called the moon presence? The workshop chord's description says Gehrman's chord precipitated the encounter with the pale moon, which beckoned the hunters and conceived the hunter's dream. That is all the game tells you about the origin of the bargain. A bare sequence of cause and effect without naming what drove Gehrman to seek contact in the first place. The community's prevailing interpretation, supported by the visual evidence of the broken doll in the abandoned old workshop and the timing of events after the fishing hamlet massacre, is that Gehrman sought the moon presence out of grief over Lady Maria, that he wanted the doll he had built to be brought to life, and that the moon presence answered. But the game never states this directly. The doll's creation and Gehrman's binding may be separate events, or the price of the same bargain. Why would a being of such incomprehensible power enter into an arrangement over a grieving old man's loneliness? Some interpretations suggest the moon presence needed a conduit, a way to maintain the hunt and cull the other great ones, and Gehrman simply provided an opening. But the tenderness with which the moon presence descends and wraps itself around the player in the second ending, almost cradling them, suggests something far more personal than simple utility. The nature of that relationship remains one of the game's most quietly devastating open questions. The true nature of the moon presence, she is referred to as Flora by the doll, who kneels before a gravestone and prays, "O Flora, of the moon, of the dream." In the English version of the game, this name appears only in the doll's prayer. The boss's health bar simply reads Moon Presence. In the Japanese version, Flora is more explicitly confirmed as the Moon Presence's name. Her physical form is one of the game's most haunting designs, a long human spine wrapped in too many ribs, limbs like pale, branching bone, and a head that is mostly a nest of writhing black tendrils. She appears only twice as an active participant, when she descends to bind the hunter as a new caretaker of the dream, and when she fights to kill you for resisting her. Based on what we can observe, the moon presence rules the hunter's dream, sustains the hunt, and maintains the cycle through which blood echoes are gathered and hunters pass. A note in the Nightmare Lecture Hall connects her to Lawrence, who apparently first beckoned her. The nameless moon presence beckoned by Lawrence and his associates, Pale Blood. But whether she created the dream for her own purposes, or was simply the entity that answered when called, and whether those two things are different, the game never says. One interpretation suggests she is seeking her own surrogate child, just as all great ones do, and Gehrman was her first. Another reading, developed by community scholars, connects her to a broader lunar feminine principle in the game's cosmology. Both have evidence behind them. Neither can be confirmed. The umbilical cord. That shouldn't exist. There are 4, 1/3 of umbilical cord items in the game, but you only need 3 to unlock the true ending. The 4th comes from the abandoned old workshop, sitting on the memory altar inside the building. Its description reads, "Every great one loses its child, and then yearns for a surrogate." The 3rd umbilical cord precipitated the encounter with the pale moon, which beckoned the hunters and conceived the hunter's dream. That sentence is doing enormous work. It connects this specific cord not to the healing church or to Mensis, but to the creation of the hunter's dream itself. Which means this is almost certainly the cord that Gehrman used when he first called out to the moon presence after the loss of Lady Maria. The dream was conceived through it. Based on what we can observe, whoever held this cord before leaving it in the workshop was directly involved in the bargain that imprisoned Gehrman and brought Flora into the equation. The most coherent reading is that this cord is Gehrman's own, the artifact of his desperation, preserved in the workshop like a relic of the moment when everything changed. But the game never explains how he obtained it, what he gave in exchange for it, or whether he knew what binding himself to the dream would truly mean. The existence of a 4th cord that the game doesn't require you to use is one of those quietly staggering design decisions that rewards the players who find it with nothing but more questions. What happened to the real Iosefka? When you first arrive in Yharnam, a doctor named Iosefka speaks to you through a locked door at her clinic. Her voice is warm, careful. She says she will care for any survivors you send her way. Then something changes. By the time you can access the clinic from the back entrance through the Forbidden Woods, the voice behind the locked door has become cold and clinical. A second Iosefka, an imposter, almost certainly a high-ranking choir operative, has taken the original's place. The real Iosefka's fate is one the game encodes through a single devastating detail. When you enter the clinic through the back and encounter the celestial mob enemies wandering the rooms, one of them drops Iosefka's blood vial when killed. The implication is that the real Iosefka was the imposter's first patient. Transformed into one of the very emissaries her replacement was manufacturing. She did not flee. She became a specimen. The imposter took her clinic, her identity, and the lives of every survivor sent to her for safety. What the real Iosefka knew or believed in the moments before her transformation, whether she recognized what was happening to her. The game gives you only the echo of a dropped item and the memory of a kind voice through a locked door. Ariana's bloodline and Odin's reach. In Odin Chapel, you may shelter a woman of the night named Ariana. She's kind, resigned, marked by a weariness that makes her generosity feel like something carried rather than freely given. The chapel dweller calls her blood, similar indeed to what was once forbidden, and a member of the old healing church would recognize it immediately. Ariana wears a noble dress, and the item description confirms she is a distant relative of Queen Annalise of Cainhurst, the Vile Blood Queen, whose blood is the most prized in Yharnam. After you defeat Mikolash, Ariana retreats to a basement beneath the chapel and gives birth to a deformed celestial child. If you kill the child, it drops a 1/3 of umbilical cord, confirming the infant is a spawn of Odin, the formless Great One who exists only in voice. Odin apparently impregnated Ariana without her knowledge. The Odin Writhe rune references the subtle mucus in the warmth of blood, and the game hints that Odin uses blood as a transmission medium, acting through intimacy and blood exchange, rather than direct contact. Why Ariana specifically? The most compelling reading is that her aristocratic bloodline, those distant vile blood roots, made her an ideal vessel. But whether Odin chose her deliberately or whether her proximity to his chapel simply made her accessible is never confirmed, and Ariana herself has no idea what has happened to her. The formless god and his chapel. Odin Chapel is the humblest structure dedicated to any Great One in Yharnam. It is a simple stone room with a modest altar and a handful of desperate survivors seeking refuge inside it. For the patron deity of a city obsessed with blood, since the formless Odin rune says the essence of the formless Great One, Odin, is blood itself. The chapel is conspicuously unremarkable. The Carol rune description states that both Odin and his inadvertent worshippers surreptitiously seek the precious blood. Inadvertent worshippers. The people of Yharnam have been drinking Odin's essence without knowing it, worshipping a god through consumption. The word surreptitiously, meaning secretly, sneakily, applies equally to Odin and to his followers. This could imply that Odin is a passive force who merely permeates the blood supply rather than an active schemer. Or it could suggest a cosmic entity operating beneath the surface of Yharnam's entire religious structure, invisible because formlessness is his nature. The tomb of Odin, where Father Gascoigne's boss Arena sits, is a graveyard. Not for Odin himself, but for his followers. It is a tomb for his flock. What that says about how Odin regards his worshippers is something the game leaves you to contemplate in silence. How long Gehrman has been waiting. Gehrman, the first hunter, is a man who has been sitting in a wheelchair in the hunter's dream for what appears to be an indeterminate span of time. Long enough that he has forgotten large stretches of his own story, long enough that his pleas can be heard outside his house if you have the insight to perceive them. He asks for Willem, for Lawrence, for someone, anyone to unshackle him. The dream is his prison, and his freedom is a mercy he now begs for. But the game never tells us how long this has been going on. The hunter's dream was conceived through the workshop cord, and the cord's description says the hunt was beckoned, implying the dream predates the current night and possibly predates the Healing Church's formal organization entirely. Did the moon presence bind him the same night she answered his call? Or gradually, as the contract's terms revealed themselves, was it immediate? The doll animated, the dream created, Gehrman imprisoned all at once. The timeline between the dissolution of the original workshop, the founding of the Healing Church, the fishing hamlet massacre, and Gehrman's binding has never been laid out explicitly by the game. What we can observe is that Gehrman has been here long enough that the men he calls out for have died and transformed and been killed again, and he is still waiting. That duration, left deliberately unmeasured, is one of the quietest horrors in the game. The abandoned old workshop and its doll, hidden behind a series of careful drops inside the Healing Church workshop, reached by descending through the wooden floors and dropping to a door below, is the abandoned old workshop, a crumbling, exact mirror of Gehrman's domain in the hunter's dream, dark and dusty and full of things left behind. Inside you find the memory altar, where the umbilical cord rests, a chest with a doll set, and, sitting abandoned on the floor, a broken doll. She is identical to the living doll who walks the garden in the dream, same proportions, same porcelain face. But she is still cold and untouched by whatever animates her counterpart. She is what the doll looked like before the moon presence breathed something into her. Why is she here, in the waking world, rather than in the dream? One reading is that Gehrman built the doll in this physical space, found it insufficient, unable to replicate the person he lost, and then struck his bargain with the moon presence to create an animated version within the dream. Another reading suggests the doll in the workshop is simply the mold, the physical object that the dream's copy was patterned after. The presence of both the broken doll and the umbilical cord on the same altar implies these two things are connected. That Gehrman used the cord in this very room, on the night he called out to Flora, in the company of a doll that couldn't answer him. The doll's relationship to grief. The doll speaks with the same voice as Lady Maria. This is not a coincidence of casting. Both are voiced by the same actress specifically because the doll was modeled after Maria. But the doll and Maria are fundamentally different in ways the game only gestures toward. Maria was fierce, principled, ashamed of her past. The doll is gentle, patient, and carries no memory of any life before the dream. When you bow to the doll, she flinches slightly, uncertain how to receive kindness. When she prays to Flora, her words carry a longing that suggests she knows, on some level, that she is the echo of someone real. Her dialogue says she is here in this dream to look after you, and the word here is interesting, not created or sent, just here, as if she appeared in the dream with no understanding of her own origin. She functions as Gehrman's ward, his comfort, his surrogate for the person he lost. But she also seems to have developed something resembling genuine feeling over countless hunter cycles. Whether that constitutes personhood, consciousness, or something the game doesn't have a word for is a mystery that sits in every gentle thing she says. The first line of Gehrman's madness. If you have 15 or more insight and have encountered Vicar Amelia, you can hear German muttering outside his house in the workshop. He says, "Oh, Lawrence, what's taking you so long? I've grown too old for this, of little use now, I'm afraid." He thinks Lawrence is coming. He is waiting for a man who has been dead for what may be centuries. A man who became the first cleric beast and was killed and had his skull placed on an altar as an object of worship. The game gives you this line and leaves you to carry its weight. Is this dementia, the natural decay of an ancient mind trapped too long in the dream? Or is it something the moon presence has done to him? A deliberate blurring of time designed to keep him pliable and contained? The further implication that Gehrman and Lawrence worked together closely enough that their relationship was a source of stability for the old hunter, perhaps the last one, suggests a friendship the game never fully explores. What did these two men mean to each other? What was the nature of a bond strong enough that Gehrman is still waiting for Lawrence across what may be centuries of solitude? Master Willem's final obsession. At the end of Bergenwerth's long, overgrown campus, on a veranda overlooking the deep lake where Rom dwells, sits an old man in a rocking chair. He is barely alive, desiccated and staring, his mouth moving without sound. He is Master Willem, the provost of Bergenwerth, the man who warned Lawrence to fear the old blood, who spent his life trying to line his brain with eyes so that he could think like a great one. He cannot speak, he cannot move, but he is still there, still rocking, still staring at the lake where his greatest creation, or greatest mistake, the spider Rom, guards the secret of the Mensis ritual from sight. The description of the cord connected to Willem says he sought it in order to elevate his being and thoughts to those of a great one, by lining his brain with eyes, the only choice he knew if man were to ever match their greatness. Did he succeed? Is what sits in that chair the result of Willem lining his brain with eyes, a man who got what he wanted and found it insufficient, or insufficient in a way that left him unable to do anything at all with what he had gained? The game places him there, at the edge of everything he set in motion, witnessing the consequences of Bergenwerth's ambition in perfect, terrible silence, and refuses to tell you whether that silence is wisdom or simply the end of a man who reached too far. The secret of Rom, the vacuous spider. She is called vacuous, meaning empty or mindless, yet Rom was once a scholar. A vacuous spider, inhabitant of the Bergenwerth lake. The Lunarium key description calls her a spider who once was human. More than that, Mikolash shouts that Rom was granted eyes, and like the vacuous slug that she was, took that gift and hid from the truth. This implies that Kos granted Rom eyes directly, real cosmic insight, and rather than using that gift to pursue greater truth, Rom used it to hide. She sits at the bottom of the Bergenwerth lake and maintains a veil of illusion over the Mensis ritual, preventing the blood moon from being seen. She is a willing shield around Mikolash's scheme. Whether this was Rom's own choice, a cosmic imperative she was compelled to follow after her transformation, or something the Great Ones forced upon her the moment they gifted her with insight, the game never explains. A former human scholar who was transformed into a massive, pale spider and assigned a cosmic role she never asked for. If that's not a tragedy, it's at least a mystery worth sitting inside. Why Ebrietas weeps, deep in the choir's domain in the upper cathedral ward, past the pews and the singing women and the horrors waiting in the dark, you find Ebrietas, daughter of the cosmos. She is vast, tentacled, and when you first encounter her, she is not attacking. She is pressed against a wall, head bowed, body shuddering in what reads unmistakably as grief. The description of the Great One's wisdom item states that Ebrietas, unlike the other Great Ones, remained behind. The choir made contact with her and built their research around her presence, using her blood for experiments, seeking to reach the cosmos through proximity to a being that had already come from it. But why did she stay when the others left or withdrew? One reading is that she was left behind against her will, abandoned by her own kind in a world she never chose to remain in. Another suggests she chose to stay, perhaps drawn to the human scholars who came seeking her, finding in them something the cosmos lacked. And a third possibility is that she simply could not leave, that whatever drew her to this world or kept her here was beyond her capacity to sever. When you finally approach her, she turns and attacks with ferocity. But the first image the game gives you is a grieving entity alone in a cathedral, pressing herself against inscribed stone, as if searching for something that is no longer written there. The game never tells you what she mourns, and the choir, who knew her best, are gone. The brain of Mensis and what it remembers. In the nightmare of Mensis, suspended in a tower high above the landscape, is the brain of Mensis, a massive, pale, eyeball-covered entity that drains your health and sanity with a gaze that can only be escaped by using the environment as cover, or by dropping it into a bottomless pit via a lever on a nearby balcony. The living string item description says, the immense brain that Mensis retrieved from the nightmare was indeed lined with eyes on the inside, but they were of an evil sort, and the brain was terribly rotten. But even still, it was a legitimate Great One and left a relic. Mensis did not create this thing. They retrieved it. They pulled a Great One out of the nightmare and installed it in a tower in Murgo's loft, where it now serves as a passive weapon against intruders. The brain is a Great One with eyes on the inside. Exactly what both Willem and Mikolash sought to become. But the eyes were of an evil sort. The brain is rotten. Whether the School of Mensis knew this when they retrieved it, whether they considered it a failure or simply a necessary instrument, and what exactly makes eyes of a cosmic nature evil by the game's own framing. These questions sit around an entity that the game describes in full in one item description, and then leaves you to interpret. If you use the make contact gesture in front of it, it gives you a rune. The Moon Rune's description says, the Great Ones that inhabit the nightmare are sympathetic in spirit, and often answer when called upon. A rotten, evil-eyed Great One that answers a gesture of kinship. That contradiction is one of the game's finest unresolved mysteries. The nightmare's architecture. The Hunter's Nightmare is a location built from misery and memory. It mirrors parts of Yharnam but distorted. Familiar streets bent at wrong angles, buildings half submerged in rivers of blood. The sky, a permanent red wound. Old hunters who succumb to bloodlust are trapped here, repeating their worst moments endlessly. But the specific architecture of the nightmare draws from multiple sources. The Grand Cathedral appears twice, once in the nightmare and once in the waking world, so identical that the evidence points toward the original being pulled into the nightmare and the current Grand Cathedral being a later reconstruction. The lecture building from Bergenwerth also exists in the nightmare, suggesting that when the Mensis ritual failed catastrophically, it dragged the building itself into the dream. Some scholars believe that the entirety of the nightmare is built from the memories of the dead hunters who populate it, a collective unconscious, made architectural. Others argue the moon presence or Murgo constructed it deliberately. Whether nightmares in Bloodborne are passive reflections of suffering or active constructions with purpose and design is a question the game raises everywhere and answers nowhere. Ludwig's last memory. Ludwig the Accursed was the first of the Healing Church hunters, the founder of a tradition, a man spoken of with reverence in weapon descriptions throughout the game. The Holy Moonlight Sword's description says he discovered it in a vision of the dark, and that it represents Ludwig's memories and the mercy he bestowed upon his compatriots. When you defeat Ludwig in the hunter's nightmare, his body splits. The upper half remains alive, blinking, slowly regaining something like lucidity. If you speak to him with church-affiliated attire, he recognizes you as one of his own. He asks, "Did I fight well? Were my efforts worthy? In my time, I was called a beast hunter, or some such. I forget." He dies not knowing whether he has been honorable, but his description says his beast form still retained a faint sanity due to the Holy Moonlight Sword. The sword is found later in the game only after Bredor kills Ludwig. The question of what Ludwig remembers, what he wanted, and whether the mercy he once gave to others was the same mercy he begged for in the nightmare. These are threads the game lays down and leaves untied, inviting you to feel their weight without explaining them. Bredor, the church assassin. In the basement of the research hall is a man locked in a cell, wearing the skin of a beast over his head like a mask. He is Bredor, a church assassin who committed a terrible act. Upon witnessing a colleague summon an unspeakable beast, as one item description puts it, he slayed the summoner and was so haunted by the memories of what he'd seen that he requested to be thrown in a cell. He begs for you not to open his cell door, and yet, if you carry the inner chamber key and unlock it, he turns hostile and hunts you. Even in his cell, he sends nightmare versions of himself to attack you if you progress too far through the DLC. Bredor is a man who imprisoned himself out of guilt and horror, then became the thing he was ashamed of. A hunter who cannot stop hunting. The beast skin he wears raises its own question. Was it the beast his colleague summoned? Is he wearing it as punishment or as a trophy? The game places both possibilities in front of you and steps back. Simon the Harrowed asks questions about the original sin that the church has committed. Bredor may be the living answer to that question. The caretakers in the astral clock tower. The research hall is full of failed experiments. Patients whose heads have been opened, whose eyes are sewn onto their skulls or removed entirely, who have been reduced to weeping, crawling things that still occasionally speak. They call out for water. They have been abandoned by the church that experimented on them. Lady Maria cared for them, at least for a time. And in the astral clock tower above the research hall, more of these patients exist. But they have built something like a shrine to Maria. They hold her up as a saint, a caretaker who stayed when everyone else left. The question the game raises, and does not answer, is whether Maria's care was genuine or whether she maintained it as penance. Her weapon was thrown down a well. She swore off hunting. The patients died one by one, and she remained. Eventually, she took her own life in the clock tower, and the nightmare took her to guard the very secret she was already keeping. Was this her choice, her punishment, or something the nightmare arranged for its own reasons? The fact that her voice actress is the same as the doll's, and that she performs an almost maternal gesture during her special visceral attack, only deepens what the game refuses to explain. The fate of the fishing hamlet, the village that sits above the hunter's nightmare, is one of the most haunting locations in the game. It has been pulled into the nightmare itself, its residents transformed into mutated half-fish abominations still maintaining the ruins of a life they no longer live. They carry tools. They guard the shore where Kos washed up and died. They remember, at some primal level, what was done to them and what was taken. The accursed brew, a mutated skull dropped only if you speak to one of the villagers while wearing the milkweed rune, has a description that reads, "Skull of a local from the violated fishing village." The inside of the skull was forcibly searched for eyes, as evidenced by innumerable scratches and indentations. Forcibly searched for eyes. That phrase does enormous work. Someone came here and cracked open skulls looking for the cosmic insight that the parasites from Kos were granting the villagers. The befuddled villager, if you approach wearing the milkweed rune, calls out, "Bergenwerth, Bergenwerth, blasphemous murderers, blood-crazed fiends." It was Bergenwerth, but whether Willem ordered it, whether Gehrman participated, whether the church hunters came afterward or alongside, the specific order of events, who gave the command and who carried it out, is something the game has never fully told us. What Kos actually was. Kos is dead when the game begins, and has been dead for what may be a very long time. Her enormous body rests on the shore of the fishing hamlet, and even in her death, she has continued to exert influence. The parasites that lived inside her have infested the village, and from them comes the milkweed rune, and the Kos parasite weapon, and the strange transcendence implied by both. The orphan of Kos screams when he emerges from her corpse. What Kos was before she died, how she came to be in the sea, what her relationship to the cosmos was, whether she arrived at the fishing hamlet deliberately or was driven there by something. The game provides no answers. The parasites from her body are described as not of this world. She is connected to the sea, and the scholars believed great ones had some fundamental connection to deep water. But the nature of that connection, the life Kos lived before her death, and what her child hoped to accomplish after emerging from her body, are questions the game poses with tremendous emotional weight and leaves entirely open. The orphan's cry. When the orphan of Kos is born from his mother's corpse, or when you approach it and it wrenches itself free, he screams at the sky. It is one of the most viscerally upsetting sounds in the game. He is enormous, draped in what appears to be a fetal membrane, wielding a weapon made from what may be his own placenta. He is feral and grieving and completely without language, and yet his second phase ends not with his death, but with what sounds like a farewell cry aimed upward, toward the sky, toward something unreachable. The orphan is never named in any in-game text as Kos's son. He is simply the orphan. Every great one loses his child. Kos lost hers before the game began. The scholars took the umbilical cord, and now the child emerges, already too late, into a nightmare built from the suffering his mother's death caused. Whether he is aware on some cosmic level of everything that happened to his mother and her village, whether his grief is for her or simply the grief of a being born into tragedy, the game never says. But that cry at the sky is one of the most carefully designed emotional moments in all of Bloodborne, and it has no answer. The Pthumerians and the older world, deep beneath Yharnam, in the Chalice dungeons, is evidence of a civilization far older than anything the Healing Church built. The Pthumerians were humble guardians of the slumbering Great Ones, according to the Chalice descriptions, who lived in the labyrinth and tended to beings of cosmic power sleeping in the stone below the city. Over time, their descendants felt entitled to name themselves rulers of this world. They developed their own culture, their own monarchy, their own relationship to the old blood. A relationship that predates Bergenwerth by what may be thousands of years. The Thumerian monarch was traditionally a woman who assumed a name with classical roots. The queens of Thumeru were chosen for their blood. The Great Ones were already nesting here, already seeking surrogates, already exerting their gravity on human civilization. Long before Lawrence and Willem and German ever walked these streets, how old is the cycle? How many times has Yharnam, or something like Yharnam, been consumed by the same ritual of blood and beasts and desperate scholars reaching toward the sky? The Chalice dungeons are the oldest text in the game, and they are written in a language we can only partially read. Queen Yharnam of Thumeru. At the bottom of the Pthumerian Eye-Hill Chalice, you encounter Yharnam, the Pthumerian queen. She is pregnant. She is surrounded by a red lake. She does not fight you cleanly. She projects images of herself, bleeding, weeping, gesturing. There is something in her expression that looks almost like warning. The umbilical cord from her fight, the one tied to Murgo, says, Uden, the formless Great One, is no different. To think it was corrupted blood that began this eldritch liaison. Corrupted blood. Uden chose her, or her blood drew him, or the Pthumerians arranged the meeting as part of their service to the sleeping Great Ones. She appears a second time at the entrance to Murgo's loft, crouched and bleeding over a puddle, still weeping. She has lost her child to the nightmare. She is perpetually in the moment of that loss. Whether she has any awareness of the full scope of what happened to her, whether she chose her role as Uden's vessel, or was sacrificed to it by the Pthumerian tradition, is a question the game encodes in the image of a woman forever weeping over what her body was used for. The Murgo question. Murgo is a Great One who does not physically exist in the game. When you defeat Murgo's wet nurse in the highest tower of the Nightmare of Mensis, you hear a child crying, and then the crying stops. The text on screen reads, Nightmare Slain. The game rewards you with a Great One's umbilical cord, and the description confirms Murgo is the child of Uden and the Pthumerian queen. But you never see Murgo. The crib in the wet nurse's arena is empty. The crying comes from nowhere. Murgo is, like his father Uden, a being that exists only in some form beyond physical reality, formless, like his father, which makes him visible only as sound and consequence. The Healing Church and the School of Mensis both built their most dangerous experiments around gaining access to this infant Great One. German, outside his house, says after Murgo's death, the night is near its end. The death of a Great One ends the nightmare and allows the sun to rise. But whether Murgo was a victim, a trap, or simply a cosmic fact of existence whose cry sustained the nightmare purely through the grief of a god, the game leaves this in a silence that feels like the loudest thing in it. The Mensis ritual's true purpose. Mikolash did not simply want to speak to a Great One. The Murgo's wet nurse cord description says, this cord granted Mensis audience with Murgo, but resulted in the stillbirth of their brains. That one sentence is the game's only direct account of what the Mensis ritual accomplished. The community's prevailing reading, supported by the presence of Queen Yharnam's weeping form at the entrance to Murgo's loft, and by the connection between Uden and Murgo, is that the School of Mensis obtained a Thumerian umbilical cord from the deep labyrinths and used it to perform the ritual in Yahar'gul. The ritual technically succeeded. Mensis gained an audience with Murgo. The cost was the stillbirth of their scholars' brains. Most of the school merged into the One Reborn, or became mummified figures with cages on their heads, their minds trapped in the nightmare they created. Mikolash alone survived with any semblance of coherent identity, which is why he is the host. But the game never fully explains what he hoped contact with Murgo specifically would give him. He wanted eyes. He wanted to overcome beastly idiocy. Whether his goal was the specific knowledge a stillborn Great One held, the kind of elevation that contact with any Great One could provide, or something more personal to Mikolash's own vision of greatness. The game leaves that ambition as incomplete as the ritual itself. Why Murgo's wet nurse has 8 arms? Murgo's wet nurse is one of the more visually striking bosses in a game full of them. A tall, cloaked figure with multiple shadowy arms that sweep out in all directions, carrying blades of dark energy, briefly multiplying as if she exists in several places at once. She's attending to an infant Great One who does not physically exist. She appears from darkness and retreats into it. Her description says only that she is a surrogate mother, cultivated in the nightmare to tend to Murgo. Cultivated. Not born, not summoned, cultivated. This word implies she was made specifically for this role, possibly by Murgo's will, possibly by Eden seeking to care for his child, possibly by the dream itself following some logic the game never maps out for us. Why 8 arms? Why the cloaked appearance that makes her look almost liturgical? Why does she multiply during the fight? The game places her at the center of the nightmare and never explains her origin, her nature, or what cultivated means for a being that exists in a nightmare. The Holy Moonlight Sword's true origin. In the base game, the description of the Holy Moonlight Sword says only that very few have ever set eyes on the Holy Moonlight Sword. In the Old Hunters, Ludwig discovers it in a vision of the dark, and the sword represents Ludwig's memories and the mercy he bestowed upon his compatriots. But the sword is associated with the moon, with the church, and with a power that predates both Ludwig and the healing church. One reading connects it to the moon presence directly, suggesting the sword is a physical expression of Flora's power. Another connects it to the Pthumerians, or to the Great Ones who dwell in the moon's proximity. Archibald, the eccentric scholar who created the Tonitrus, studied the divine pillar of radiance that strikes Ludwig, suggesting the sword's light is documented in church scholarship as something other than a weapon. The sword existed before Ludwig found it. He found it in a vision. Whether it was waiting for him or whether he was the first to find it and bring it into physical reality is a question that has no answer in any item description. What happened to the original workshop? The abandoned old workshop inside the hunter's dream is the original space where the workshop, the hunting organization Gehrman founded, first operated. It is preserved in the dream, untouched and gathering dust. But in the waking world, the workshop was dissolved by the healing church after they formed their own hunters. The transition from the original hunter tradition to the church's controlled hunting guild is one of the most consequential events in Yharnam's history, and the game presents almost none of it. We know the workshop made specialized weapons and used blood to enhance them. We know Gehrman was its founder. We know the church shut it down and replaced it with something more controllable. But the politics of that dissolution, the fate of the original hunters who served under Gehrman, and whether Gehrman resisted or simply allowed it to happen from inside his dream prison, these are entirely absent from the game's explicit text. The old workshop exists as a physical artifact of what was lost, and the game lets you feel that loss without explaining it. The Choir and the Stars. The choir is the most elevated and secretive division of the Healing Church, operating in the upper cathedral ward above the main Grand Cathedral. Their goal, based on item descriptions, was to make contact with the sky, to reach the Great Ones through arcane elevation rather than through blood or nightmares. The Cosmic Eye Watcher badge, unlocked through the choir's domain, describes it as granting access to the realm of the choir, the high stratum of the healing church. The upper cathedral key description says the key opens the upper echelons of the healing church and connects it to the school of Menses as the two highest branches, the great ones of the sky, the celestial emissaries, Ibrietas, the cosmic entities glimpsed through the stained glass windows, were the choir's domain. They apparently succeeded in making contact with Ibrietas, who stayed behind when the others left. But what specifically the choir did with that contact, whether they made progress toward their goal of cosmic elevation, and what became of the choir members after the city's collapse. The game shows you their research and their space without ever completing the story of what they found there. The celestial emissary's true identity. Throughout the game, you encounter small, translucent, wide-eyed humanoid creatures with heads like blue glass lanterns. They are called celestial emissaries, and they walk peacefully in the upper cathedral ward until provoked, at which point they fight back with star-like projectiles. The key detail is buried in Iosefka's behavior. The survivors you send to her clinic are transformed into these things. She describes the process as rapturous, as a blessing. The celestial emissaries are ascended humans, people who were converted from their original form into something the church considered a higher state of being. One stands taller than the others in the upper cathedral ward and serves as a boss fight, but the game never explicitly names who any of these people were before their transformation, whether they consented, or whether any of them are aware of what happened to them. The formless Odin rune dropped by one of them when you kill it, because the young Yharnam girl was sent to the clinic by the player and transformed, is perhaps the most disturbing detail in the game. A child became a god. The game lets you do it. It never tells you how to feel about that. The afflicted beggar's true past. In the DLC, there is a character known only as the afflicted beggar, who crouches near the beginning of the hunter's nightmare. He is harrowed, injured, and wears a hood that matches Simon's harrowed hood. He speaks vaguely about having been a hunter, about the blood being too much. If you kill him, he drops beast blood pellets, suggesting he has already begun his transformation. His connection to Simon is implied through the matching attire, but never confirmed. Was he a church hunter like Simon? Did the bloodlust simply take him faster? The game drops this tiny, visually encoded connection between two characters and provides no resolution. In a game full of hunters who broke under the weight of the hunt, the afflicted beggar exists as a case study with no file attached. A tragedy you encounter only briefly before it becomes another beast to kill. The executioners and their vow. The executioners of the healing church wore the executioner set, attire that would later become the basis for all church attire, according to its description, and carried the Ligarius's wheel. Their leader was Alfred, a man who idolizes Master Ligarius and seeks to destroy the vile blood queen Annalise. The lore of the executioners suggests they were a church-sanctioned group tasked with purging those who consorted with the vile bloods, hunters who were considered heretics for drinking blood from aristocratic sources that the church had not sanctioned. But the executioners also appear to have cut Lady Maria's throat, based on the visual evidence of her body in the clock tower. Whether this was a sanctioned execution, a personal vendetta, or an attempt to prevent her from talking about the fishing hamlet is never addressed. The game gives you Ligarius as a guardian of Cainhurst and Alfred as his devoted successor, but the complete history of what the executioners actually did in Yharnam, and whether Maria's fate was one of their actions, is left in the dark. Alfred's true agenda. Alfred is genuinely enthusiastic about hunting in a way that reads as either admirable or deeply unnerving depending on your perspective. He loves the work. He reveres Logarius. He speaks of the vile bloods with genuine contempt, and of his mission with a devotion that has no room for doubt. When you give him the Cainhurst summons, and he arrives to send Annalise unto the wolves, he murders the queen with the wheel, and then, in a moment of quiet joy, thanks you. Later, you find him near the queen's throne, having performed some kind of ritual over her crushed remains, his laughter becoming something that no longer sounds entirely human. The transformation of a righteous hunter into something cracked by zeal happens over the course of one questline. The Logarius's wheel description says the weapon was used to slaughter the vile bloods in Cainhurst, bathed in pools of their blood and forever steeped in their ire. It is still soaked in the blood of the people Logarius killed. Alfred inherited not just the weapon, but the rage it contains. The Wheel Hunter badge description calls the executioner's workshop a secretive enclave of mystical beliefs and heady fanaticism. Was Alfred always this close to that edge? Was his devotion to Logarius always more religious mania than human loyalty? The item descriptions suggest Logarius himself was a man of complicated motives, and Alfred, his faithful inheritor, may be the echo of something Logarius himself could not contain. The clocks in the clock tower. The astral clock tower is accessed through the Healing Church Research Hall after defeating the living failures. It is a vast space built around an enormous astronomical clock, its face covered in arcane runes. The clock appears to track something: the movement of celestial bodies, the progression of the blood moon, or perhaps something more personal, some countdown that the choir designed. But the clock is never explained. Its mechanism, its function, the reason the Healing Church needed a clock capable of tracking something astronomical. These are questions the game raises through architecture and never addresses through dialogue or item description. The patients who were transformed in the hall below exist in the shadow of this clock, as if whatever it measures was the true purpose of their suffering. Lady Maria guards it, the nightmare guards it, and whatever it was built to announce has either never arrived or arrived long ago. The Living Failures and the Choir's Dream. The Living Failures are a boss fight that takes place in what appears to be a garden of lumen flowers on the roof of the Healing Church buildings. They are partial failures. Humans who were attempted to be elevated into something greater, who became grotesque celestial beings with too many limbs and not enough coherence. They fight together, calling down stars, reaching upward, still trying to complete a transformation their bodies rejected. The description of the choir garb says its members believed they were reaching the cosmos, that they were within earshot of the gods. The living failures are the people for whom that earshot never became anything more. They are the evidence of the process that produced the celestial emissaries, the experiments that went wrong versus the experiments that, by the Church's estimation, succeeded. But who specifically these people were, whether they volunteered, and whether any of them are aware enough to experience their current state as suffering. The game places them in front of you and lets the lumen flowers speak. The lumen flowers' significance. Lumen flowers appear throughout Bloodborne, in the hunter's dream, in the research hall, on the roof where the living failures dwell, and as a brooch on both Lady Maria's chest and on the doll's dress. The description of the lumen flower says it faces the moon rather than the sun and blooms in the shadows. The choir used lumen flower gardens to try to communicate with the cosmos, the flowers acting as antennae or offerings aimed at the sky. The connection to Lady Maria, whose name may mean Sea of Bitterness, through the brooch suggests a personal significance beyond the purely clinical. Did Maria wear the flower as a symbol of the church's mission, as a token of her loyalty to Gehrman's tradition, as something private and unexplained that the game chose to encode visually without ever addressing? The doll, wearing the same brooch, deepens the mystery without resolving it. The imposter, Iosefka's transcendence. When you reach the real Iosefka's clinic through the back entrance from the Forbidden Woods, after the blood moon rises, you find the imposter Iosefka lying on an examination table, visibly in pain, describing her condition in terms that suggest something is happening inside her. She says she can feel something writhe inside her head. She calls it rapturous. She believes she has been chosen. If you kill her, she drops a third of umbilical cord. Her cord's description, however, is notable. Rather than describing a pregnancy with a great one as Ariana's does, it reads, Provost Willem sought the cord in order to elevate his being and thoughts to those of a great one, by lining his brain with eyes. The only choice, he knew, if man were to ever match their greatness. This description refers to Willem's goal, not to the imposter's pregnancy. What this strongly implies is that the imposter, like Willem before her, sought the cord as a means of self-elevation, to line her own brain with eyes, to ascend through knowledge, rather than through surrogacy. The Pale Blood Hunt analysis argues she was attempting to replicate Willem's method and failed, which would explain her deteriorated state on the table. Not the rapture of a chosen vessel, but the final stage of an experiment gone wrong. Whether her experience of it as rapturous means she genuinely believed it was working, or whether she was already too far gone to recognize failure. The game gives you the body and the cord, and leaves the interpretation entirely to you. The tombs beneath the tombs. The Chalice dungeons are procedurally generated in the sense of their specific layouts, but their lore is consistent and ancient. The deeper you go, the older the civilization, until the lowest dungeons are reaching back towards something even the Thumerians no longer remembered clearly. The description of the Thumeru Ihil Chalice mentions that the Thumerians maintain these tombs, but the original architects of the labyrinth itself are never named. Something predates the Pthumerians in this subterranean world. The Great Ones were sleeping here before the Pthumerians arrived to guard them. But who built the tombs that house the sleeping gods? Who laid the first stone of the labyrinth? The game implies a depth to human history in Yharnam that stretches back into prehistory, into a time before anyone alive can remember, and the Chalice dungeons are the only window into it. A window that shows you architecture without explanation. Jura and his oath. Standing on a tower over old Yharnam, Jura watches over the beasts below. He does not call them beasts. He asks you to leave them in peace, to let them be, to spare whatever remnants of humanity persist inside the transformed citizens of old Yharnam. He was a hunter who lost faith in the hunt, or perhaps gained a different kind of faith, one that sees something worth protecting in the bestial. The description of the ashen hunter set he wears says it once belonged to a hunter who became like a beast himself, though without a beast desire. If you kill Jura, he drops the powder keg hunter badge, connecting him to an independent workshop of hunters who were expelled from the healing church for flame spraying an entire populated area. Whether this means Jura himself burned old Yharnam or simply shares this disgrace with others in his order is ambiguous. He now protects what he may have once helped destroy. Whether his oath over old Yharnam is redemption or vigil is something the game never clarifies. The source of the Ashen Blood. Old Yharnam was burned because of an epidemic called the Ashen Blood. a sickness that predated the beast scourge proper and caused the city's lower quarter to be quarantined and then torched. The description of the ashen blood mentions it was the reason for the burning of Old Yharnam, and implies that the original outbreak of disease in Yharnam, the one that first drove people to seek the old blood as a cure, was this plague. But the ashen blood's source is never identified. Was it a natural disease that created the opening the healing church exploited? A deliberate act engineered by someone who knew the old blood existed and wanted to create demand for it? A side effect of the underground experiments already occurring in the chalice labyrinths beneath the city. The burning of Old Yharnam is treated as ancient history, but it is the original wound from which everything else bleeds. The note written to no one. In the clinic where your character first awakens, the note reading "Seek pale blood to transcend the hunt" is just there, on the floor. In the Japanese version of the game, the context implies the hunter wrote this note themselves, before losing their memory, before the transfusion wiped everything. This creates a loop. You wrote your own mission statement. You guided yourself here, which means, on some level, you knew what this place was and what the hunt would demand before you submitted to it. This is one of the most quietly disturbing implications in the entire game. Who were you before the memory was taken? Why did you come to Yharnam knowing enough to leave yourself a message about pale blood? Did you know you would lose your memory? And was this your insurance against that loss? The game never revisits this question after the first 5 minutes, but it colors everything that follows. The messenger's true nature. In the hunter's dream, small, pale, fingerless creatures emerge from the ground to present items to you. They are called the messengers. They wear various hats and accessories you can give them. They appear cheerful, perhaps simple. But the description of the messenger's gift says that messengers are the messengers of the Great Ones, described as inhabitants of the dream, who find hunters like yourself, worship, and serve them. The doll says this. She calls them sweet. But who are the messengers? Where did they come from? The description of the bold hunter's mark says they speak with one voice and relay messages between the dream and the waking world. Some theories suggest the messengers are great ones in a diminished or infant state, cosmic entities reduced to servility by some mechanism the game never explains. Others suggest they are the accumulated remnants of hunters who died in the dream over many cycles. They are everywhere and entirely unaccounted for in the explicit lore. The source of the hunter's nightmare. The hunter's nightmare is explicitly described as a punishment, a place where hunters who succumb to bloodlust are trapped in an endless loop of the hunt they could not escape in life. But who imposed this punishment and when? The game suggests it emerged from the consequences of the Menses ritual, which dragged parts of Bergenwerth and the memories of dead hunters into a shared nightmare space. But the river of blood that flows through the nightmare, the church buildings visible within it, the presence of Ludwig and Lawrence and other great figures of Yharnam's past. These suggest the nightmare accumulated over a long period, rather than being created in a single event. Some community scholars argue that parts of it may predate Mensis, noting that the fishing hamlet, which is accessed through the nightmare, may have been pulled there by a separate ritual the church performed in connection with Ebrietas, which would make the nightmare's origins layered rather than singular. The game's text never maps this timeline. The architecture of suffering is stratified like geological layers, and no item description accounts for how all of it got there. Why Patches appears in the dream. In the hunter's nightmare, you can find Patches the spider. a creature who appears across multiple From Software games in various forms. In Bloodborne, he has been transformed, or is in the process of transforming, into a spider-like creature with human characteristics. He maintains the personality familiar from other Souls games. Friendly, suspicious of clerics, always trying to sell you something. His appearance here raises a question the game never addresses. Is this the same Patches, appearing across multiple From Software universes as a running-in joke, or a Yharnam resident who happened to develop the same opportunistic personality? His presence in the Hunter's Nightmare, a space that contains old hunters lost to bloodlust and the wreckage of the Church's worst deeds, implies Patches has a history in Yharnam that preceded his transformation. But what that history was, what brought him to the nightmare, and whether his cheerful composure in the face of his own spidery body is characteristic resilience or evidence of something deeply strange about Patches, the game does not say. The bloodletting beast and the missing head. Deeper in the Chalice dungeons, you encounter the bloodletting beast, a massive, stitched-together entity whose body has been opened and worked upon like a grotesque anatomy project. It can appear with or without a head depending on the chalice. Some community scholars believe the headless version is Lawrence himself, given that Lawrence's skull is kept as a relic in the Grand Cathedral, while his body was presumably disposed of after he transformed. The stitching on the bloodletting beast's body suggests experimentation, which connects to the choir's practices. If this is Lawrence, it means his body was not simply burned or buried after his death as the first cleric beast. It was used for something. Whether the Healing Church performed experiments on the body of their founder, whether they were trying to understand what he had become, or whether the headless bloodletting beast is simply an unrelated creature that happens to share a physique. The game presents both possibilities and confirms neither. The mystery of the Mensis cage. The iron cage worn on the heads of Mensis scholars and given to you as an item the game calls deeply flawed. Its description says it was one of the forbidden results of the Mensis ritual, and that it serves to bring the wearer's thoughts to the attention of the Great Ones. You can wear it. The game gives you a -9 to beasthood and a +3 to kin, meaning you are trading your beastly capacity for something more cosmic. But the deeply flawed qualifier is interesting. The cage worked enough to attract a Great One's attention, but not enough to ensure the nature of that contact was beneficial. Every scholar who wore one either had their brain stillbirted or became something monstrous. The cage, as an artifact, raises the question of what Mensis was attempting, that the cage was the best instrument they could devise, and what the version of the cage that wasn't deeply flawed might have looked like. Jura's powder kegs and the Church's judgment. The powder kegs were a group of hunters expelled from the Healing Church workshop for flame spraying an entire populated area. The description doesn't say they were wrong to do it, just that it was judged impermissible. Old Yharnam was already burning at the time, and the beasts within it were spreading. The powder keg's response to an emergency was apparently more extreme than the Church was willing to endorse publicly. But given that the Church regularly conducted experiments on unwitting subjects, transformed innocents into celestial beings, and caused the deaths of thousands through blood addiction, the moral line they drew against the powder keg seems worth examining. Was the Church's condemnation of the flames spraying a genuine ethical judgment, or simply a public relations decision? Was Jura one of the hunters who burned old Yharnam? His position atop that tower, watching over the transformed survivors below, suggests a guilt the game never lets him articulate. The Vileblood legacy. Canehurst Castle. is approached through a summons, a carriage that appears at night and carries you to a place that should not exist. A Gothic castle untouched by time, its interior still lit, its Cainhurst Vilebloods still wandering the halls as spectral knights. Queen Annalise sits on her throne, undying, seeking blood-dreg offerings to eventually birth the child of blood. She is immortal and patient, and entirely cut off from the world that destroyed her court. The story of the Vilebloods begins with a scholar who, according to Alfred's dialogue, betrayed his fellows at Bergenwerth and brought forbidden blood back with him to Cainhurst Castle. It was there, Alfred says, that the first of the inhuman Vilebloods was born. But the nature of what that blood was, whether the scholar knew what he was creating, and whether Queen Annalise was always what she is now, or became it through the Vileblood legacy. These are threads the game cuts before following them through. Alfred himself, as the sworn enemy of the Vilebloods, is not a neutral narrator. Whether his account of their origin is entirely accurate or shaped by centuries of executioner bias is worth keeping in mind. Alfred's wheel and the Ligarius connection. Ligarius's wheel is described as a weapon used to slaughter the Vilebloods of Cainhurst, bathed in their blood and forever steeped in their ire. The weapon still carries the rage of everyone it killed. Master Ligarius did not seal Cainhurst out of pure righteousness. The Wheel Hunter badge description calls the executioner's workshop a secretive enclave of mystical beliefs and heady fanaticism, suggesting a group motivated by something closer to zealotry than justice. The church framed Ligarius as a crusader, a hero who gave his life to seal Cainhurst's evil. But Ligarius sits atop Cainhurst Castle in a throne of his own making, not as a victorious seal but as an ongoing containment. He didn't destroy Annalise because he couldn't. He contains her at the cost of his own mobility. Whether this is noble sacrifice or simply the best outcome he could achieve after failing his actual goal, the Church's framing of his story as triumph is at minimum incomplete. His weapon's description says it manifests the lingering rage of the Vilebloods when transformed, meaning Ligarius's tool of righteousness literally embodies the fury of his victims. That the game encodes this irony into a weapon description without commentary is characteristic of how Bloodborne conducts its moral arguments. The suspicious beggar's real history. In the Forbidden Woods, you encounter the suspicious beggar, a man who seems harmless at first, who speaks of hunting beasts for sport and asks to be directed to a safe haven. If you send him to Odin Chapel, he eventually kills the other survivors sheltered there. If you send him to Yosefka's clinic, he transforms. If you kill him, he transforms in front of you into a large beast. He was never just a man. The suspicious beggar's true nature is a beast who has maintained enough lucidity to pose as human. His behavior, seeking shelter, gaining trust, then feeding, is the nightmare version of what every blood user in Yharnam risks becoming. But who was he before? The game gives you no name, no history, no indication of when he lost his grip on humanity. He is the scourge of beasts, presented as a social threat rather than a physical one, and the fact that you can miss him entirely or save him from himself by killing him before he reaches anyone he can hurt is one of the game's quietest moral quandaries. The Cainhurst summons and its origin. To access Cainhurst Castle, you need a Cainhurst summons found in Iosefka's clinic. A note with the summons instructs the reader to go to Hemwick Charnel Lane and wait for a carriage at the end of the road. Someone left this summons in Iosefka's clinic for a reason, and someone arranged the carriage. The implication is that Annalise or someone loyal to her has been reaching out. attempting to establish contact with the outside world despite Cainhurst being sealed by Ligarius. Whether Annalise knew who would find the summons, whether she left them deliberately for a specific type of person, or whether the vile bloods have been scattering summons across Yharnam for years, hoping someone capable would eventually arrive. The game does not specify. The carriage appears regardless of who holds the summons. Annalise greets you as if she has been expecting you. The feeling that you are guided here is one of Bloodborne's recurring themes, and Cainhurst plays into it without explanation. The dog pit of Hemwick. In the Chalnel lane leading to Hemwick, there is a pit with dogs chained inside it. The dogs are not beasts in the Scourge sense. They are ordinary animals in a place that uses them for what appears to be sacrifice or ceremony. The Witch of Hemwick, the boss of that area, uses the corpse pits and the cadaver-scented environment to harvest something. The item descriptions around Hemwick suggest the witch and her coven were connected to the healing church peripherally, providing something the church needed but couldn't or wouldn't produce itself. But the nature of the covenant, what the Witch of Hemwick gave to the church in exchange for being left alone to operate, is never explained. The witch herself barely speaks. Her death seems almost incidental to the larger story. But she existed in Yharnam's ecosystem for a reason, and the game never provides it. Henrik's betrayal. Henrik is a hunter who appears early in Bloodborne as an enemy you must fight alongside Eileen the Crow. He is hostile. He attacks on sight. But Eileen calls him a fine hunter and speaks of his history with something that sounds like regret. Henrik and Father Gascoigne were apparently partners. The old hunter. Henrik's set description says he was the most skilled of hunters, and that he worked with Gascoigne until his partner's crazed impulses drove Henrik to never again seek a partner. Something happened between these two men that drove both of them toward broken ends. Gascoigne toward blood-crazed grief, Henrik toward violence and paranoia. The nature of their falling out, what crazed impulses means in this context, and what made Henrik decide to become hostile to all hunters rather than simply retreating from the hunt. These are questions that hover over a character who dies without ever speaking a word. Father Gascoigne and his family. Father Gascoigne is the first major boss of the game, and the most human. He is a hunter who has been consumed by bloodlust, who has lost his sense of what is human and what is beast. His young daughter waits for him. She asks you to bring him home. She gives you a music box that his wife used to calm him, but the wife is already dead. Gascoigne killed her, and if you fail the daughter's questline, she eventually climbs to a rooftop and falls. The game presents this family's destruction as the consequence of the blood, but Gascoigne is simultaneously one of the most sympathetic and most horrifying figures in the game. He was hunting in the tomb of Eden. He was apparently trying to fight his own transformation. The music box visibly distresses him during his fight, but it is not enough. He was already gone before the night began. How long had he been fighting against what he was becoming? And whether the Gascoigne who is fought at the end of the night is the same man who played the music box for his wife? That question is the game's thesis in miniature. The Blood Dreg Covenant. Queen Annalise collects blood dregs, the residue that accumulates when a vile blood hunter kills another hunter in PvP. She eats them. Her goal, stated with calm patience, is to eventually accumulate enough to birth the child of blood, a new vile blood heir. But the game never explains what a child of blood would be, or what Annalise envisions for the vile blood legacy. Is she trying to resurrect the Cainhurst line? Create a being powerful enough to challenge the healing church? simply fulfill a purpose embedded in vile blood tradition that predates her own reign. Annalise has been sitting on her throne for what may be centuries, patient and eternal, and her goal, which requires the deaths of other hunters as fuel, is presented without moral framing. Whether the community should sympathize with her or condemn her is a question the game refuses to answer. Why the doll prays at Maria's grave? There is a gravestone near the base of the old tree in the hunter's dream, and the doll can be found kneeling before it, praying to Flora. This is widely believed to be Lady Maria's grave, the physical anchor of someone whose memory is woven into the fabric of the dream itself. The doll prays over the resting place of the woman she was modeled after, asking the entity that created her to watch over the hunters. There is a separate headstone nearby that serves as the portal into the hunter's nightmare, and that proximity, the grave beside the door to Yharnam's worst punishment, says something about the relationship between Maria's death and the suffering that followed it. The layers here are dense, a copy of a dead woman praying over that woman's grave, asking the entity responsible for creating the copy to protect the hunters who pass through. Whether the doll knows whose grave she is praying at, whether she has any access to the grief and history that produced her, the game withholds entirely. The doll simply kneels and prays and rises when you approach. The true purpose of the Healing Church. The Healing Church presented itself to Yharnam and the world as an institution of medicine and salvation. The old blood healed diseases that had no other cure. People came to Yharnam from across the world seeking treatment. The church grew wealthy and powerful on this reputation, but the evidence accumulated across item descriptions and NPC dialogue makes clear that the Healing Church's internal mission was always about evolution, about using the old blood not just to cure sickness, but to transform humanity into something that could eventually contact and perhaps become the Great Ones. This was Lawrence's original vision from Byrgenwerth, and the church preserved it while hiding it behind charitable medicine. What remains unclear is whether most church members knew this, whether the ordinary healers who administered blood ministration understood what the choir and the School of Mensis were actually doing, and whether the church ever came close to achieving what it set out to accomplish before the scourge consumed everything it had built. The lecture building between worlds. The Byrgenwerth lecture building exists simultaneously in the waking world and in the hunter's nightmare. In the base game, you enter it through a trap in Yahar'gul, and it serves as a transitional zone between Yharnam and the nightmare of Mensis. In the Old Hunters, you can see its spire jutting from the landscape of the hunter's nightmare. The building was apparently pulled into the nightmare during the Mensis ritual, which means part of Byrgenwerth now exists in a dimension of suffering. The students who were in the building at the time, the lecture building enemies who look like scholars dissolved into their own bodies, are still there, neither alive nor dead, trapped between the world they studied and the nightmare their studies produced. Master Willem knew what the old blood was capable of. He warned Lawrence, and the school he built ended up split across realities as a consequence of the ideas he first explored. The Murgo attendants and what they serve. In Murgo's loft, you encounter the Murgo attendants, armed figures in long robes who serve as guards. They wear hats and carry weapons and function mechanically as enemies, but their lore is almost entirely absent. Who are they? Were they humans who entered the nightmare and remained? Were they cultivated by the same process that created the wet nurse? Do they have any awareness of their role, or are they dream constructs, automatons shaped from the nightmare's logic? The presence of armed guards implies someone decided the approaches to Murgo's crib needed defending. Whether that decision was made by the wet nurse, by Murgo's dream itself, or by Aiden asserting protectiveness over his child from some cosmic remove is never addressed. They exist as another architectural detail of the nightmare that the game furnishes and never explains. The Canehurst archives and the stolen blood, the scholar who brought forbidden blood back to Canehurst, the origin of the vile blood line, was described by Logarius's notes as a traitor. But forbidden by whom? The description implies the blood was taken from Bergenwerth's collection, something Willem had specifically deemed too dangerous to use. If the scholar brought it to Canehurst as a gift, or sold it, or gave it to someone who didn't understand what it was, the consequences rippled outward into a dynasty and a crusade. Whether the original scholar was motivated by ideology, greed, romantic attachment, or simple opportunism is unknown. Whether they survived to see what Canehurst became is unknown. Whether the forbidden blood was a sample of Thumerian old blood specifically, or something else entirely that Willem had sequestered, the game has never said. The origin of the vile bloods is a wound in the game's history, with no name attached to it. The old hunters and their numbers. The hunter's nightmare is described as a prison for hunters who succumb to bloodlust. But the sheer number of hunters you encounter there, wandering the river of blood, fighting each other, howling through the Grand Cathedral, implies that over the history of the hunt, an enormous number of hunters broke under the weight of the blood. The healing church trained and deployed hunters continuously. Many of them eventually lost themselves. The nightmare accumulated them, layer by layer, as the hunt continued above. But the specific mechanics of who ends up in the nightmare versus who simply dies and doesn't are never explained. Gehrman has been in the hunter's dream, not the nightmare, which suggests a different kind of binding. Some hunters who died are simply gone. Others are trapped here. What determines which fate they receive, and whether it has anything to do with how they died or who they were? The game offers no answer. The Plain Doll's slow awakening. Over the course of a playthrough, the doll's dialogue changes. Initially, she is formal, careful. As you progress, she begins to express something that reads like curiosity or affection. She says at one point that she has never felt the warmth of a person before you came, and that she hopes you will visit again. She talks about your sickly spirit in a way that suggests she has been watching it change. The doll was animated by the moon presence or by Gehrman's grief, and the moon presence's response to it, and she has been in the dream through countless hunter cycles, tending to each one and presumably watching each one die or wake up. Whatever feelings she has accumulated over that time, if feelings is the right word for what she experiences, are layered under her composed surface. Whether the warmth she expresses toward the player character is unique to this cycle or something she has felt and lost many times before, the game leaves entirely open. The messengers in the bath. Bath messengers are a specific variety of the small pale creatures who offer items for blood echoes. They sit in baths of water or blood and make the same gestures as the other messengers, but are apparently stationary and commercial. The distinction between these messengers and the ones who worship you in the workshop is never explained. Did the moon presence or the dream itself organize them into a shop? Did Gehrman arrange this for the hunter's convenience? The mercantile function of these messengers, who will trade blood echoes for weapons and supplies, gives the dream a logic that makes it function as a hub area. But the in-universe explanation for why these cosmic servants have been organized into a trade system is something the game never addresses. Simon's secret grief. Simon the Harrowed is one of the DLC's most honest characters, a church hunter who came to the nightmare seeking truth about the original sin, the great wrong that the church committed. He helps you. He asks you to kill Lady Maria because he believes it will give access to what he's looking for. And when you reach him at the lighthouse hut for the last time, he is wounded, shot with an arrow in his side that will eventually kill him. He dies contemplating whether the nightmare can ever end, whether the original sin can ever be paid for. His weapon, Simon's bow blade, combines a bow and a sword in a way that suggests someone who kept fighting even when he couldn't close the distance, someone who had learned to strike from wherever he stood, who Simon was before the nightmare took him, what specific act he considers the original sin worth seeking, and whether the knowledge he gained in the nightmare gave him anything like peace. These are questions his death scene gestures at without resolving. The eye rune and the third eye. The eye Carol rune is described as the three-eyed crow of Eileen the Crow. It increases discovery, meaning how often enemies drop items, but the description connects it to insight, to the idea that more eyes meant more perception, more access to cosmic truth. The Crow Hunter badge Eileen gives you depicts a crow, an animal associated throughout the game with watching and knowing. Eileen's own name, given the Crow Hunter tradition, may connect to the idea of an observer who watches the hunters rather than the beasts, a witness rather than a participant. Why a crow? What does the three-eyed crow specifically see? The rune is described as Eileen's own symbol, which means she chose it. Something about the crow's nature appealed to her understanding of her own role, and the game lets that connection float without grounding it. The Unseen Village, Yahar'gul, the Unseen Village, is described as being controlled by the School of Mensis. It is hidden from ordinary Yharnam residents. The name implies an invisibility, a sealed-off space that ordinary citizens do not know exists. The bell-ringing women who populate it are connected to the ritual that brought the blood moon, and the village shows visible signs of the ritual's catastrophic aftermath. People fused with walls, multiple bodies merged into the one reborn, creatures that are clearly more than one person now. But before the Mensis ritual, what was Yahar'gul? Was it always a Mensis stronghold? Was it a community that was taken over by the school and its residents used as raw material? The physical architecture of the village suggests a real settlement, not a purpose-built facility, which would mean the people who lived here were simply consumed by the ritual that Mikolash performed in their neighborhood. The beast-possessed soul's chains. Deep in the Chalice dungeons, you encounter the beast-possessed soul, a chained beast that has been bound with what appear to be ceremonial chains, restrained against a stone slab, as if it were a specimen or a sacrifice. Something in the dungeon kept this beast alive and contained rather than killing it. The specific function of this containment, whether it was for study, for ritual use, for the production of some substance, is left entirely to inference. The beast-possessed soul's existence implies that whoever operated in these depths knew enough about beast transformation to control it, at least temporarily. That level of knowledge about the scourge, developed before Byrgenwerth and the church were even founded, is one of the things the Chalice dungeons imply about the Pthumerian civilization that the surface world has forgotten. The Pthumerian descendant and the labyrinth's purpose. In the Chalice dungeons, the Pthumerian descendant is one of the most agile and surprising boss encounters. A hooded figure who fights with rapid, spinning blade attacks that feel unlike anything else in the game. His weapons are ceremonial looking, and his role seems to be that of a guardian. but a guardian of what, specifically, and what position he occupied in the Pthumerian hierarchy is never addressed. The labyrinth had multiple layers of guardians, and the descendants appear throughout as enforcers of something. But whether they were protecting the Great Ones, protecting the Pthumerians' blood supply, or simply performing the only function they knew in a civilization that no longer existed, the game leaves them as one more face without a name in the oldest part of Yharnam's history, the fluorescent flower and the upper ward. In the upper cathedral ward, lumen flowers grow in the halls. This area belonged to the choir, the church's highest division. The flowers face the moon. The choir used them in their rituals of cosmic contact. And among the flowers you find the living failures, the people who were transformed using the flowers as part of the ritual process. The juxtaposition of beauty and failure is deliberate. These are the most aesthetically striking ruins in the game, built for a purpose that destroyed the people who pursued it. The choir wanted to touch the sky. The flowers faced the moon. The humans between them reached upward and became something the game calls failures, even as they continued to call down stars in their broken, post-human state. Whether they wanted this, whether any of them remembers wanting it, the flowers offer no answer. The Watcher, Beasts of the Dungeons. The Watchers appear as boss encounters in the Chalice dungeons. A large beast accompanied by two smaller ones, seemingly functioning as a guard trio for a specific chamber. The description that connects to them calls them defenders of the Holy Chalice, meaning they were once something closer to sacred guardians than monsters. The scourge of beasts that consumed Yharnam also descended into the labyrinths, and the Watchers appear to be Pthumerian guardians who were transformed by the same corruption. They remember their purpose. They are still watching, still guarding. But the thing that transformed them has left only the instinct, not the intelligence. It is one of the dungeon's most quietly tragic details. Beings who were once holy, now defending sacred ground through the only means left to them. The Labyrinth Ritual Blood. The ritual blood found in the Chalice dungeons comes in different grades, and the descriptions suggest a hierarchy of purity and potency that the Pthumerians maintained carefully. The first Pthumerians, humble guardians of the Great Ones, lived in the labyrinth. The ritual blood was central to their worship and their relationship to the sleeping Great Ones below. But the details of the ritual itself, what was done with this blood, how it interacted with the Great Ones, whether it was offered or consumed or used in ways the surface world never discovered, these are completely absent from the game. The Chalice dungeons are the game's oldest story, and that story is mostly told in silhouette. Yamamura the Wanderer and his silence. In the Hunter's Nightmare, Yamamura the Wanderer is a cooperative summon who can assist you against the living failures boss fight, and who can be found imprisoned in a cell in the research hall. He wears the harrowed hunter attire and wields the Chikaga and Evelyn. He does not speak. His item description says he came to Yharnam as a foreign hunter, but imbibed of some grim knowledge that sent him to a dark place, and he fell silent and eventually lost his mind. What knowledge did Yamamura acquire? What did he find in Yharnam that was too much to carry? He is imprisoned in the research hall, suggesting the church captured him, and he is in the nightmare, suggesting he was trapped or committed some act that brought him there. A foreign hunter who came to Yharnam with his own purpose and found something he was not equipped to survive. The game offers him as a character defined entirely by what it refuses to say about him. The river of blood in the nightmare. The hunter's nightmare is partially flooded with blood, not a metaphorical red, but actual blood running through the streets and pooling in the lower areas. This blood is not incidental scenery. Blood in Bloodborne is always meaningful. The river of blood in the nightmare is usually associated with the accumulated deaths of hunters over centuries, the echoes of every kill made during every hunt that these hunters participated in, now manifesting as literal substance. But some community scholars argue the blood itself is sacred, that it is the old blood, the essence of the Great Ones, running free through a dream space uncontrolled by any institution. Whether the river of blood is punishment, evidence, or both, whether it represents what was taken from innocent citizens of Yharnam by the hunt, or what the hunters themselves spilled, is a question the architecture of the nightmare poses, and the game's text never answers. The patient in the research hall who speaks. Most of the deformed patients in the research hall are inarticulate. They weep, they call for water. They reach upward toward the skylight openings above. But one of them, encountered in a specific location, says, "I can feel it, touching my very thoughts." This line is spoken by someone who is clearly still conscious, still capable of language, still aware of what is happening to them. Which means the others may be too, simply past the ability to express it. The game includes this one patient to make sure you understand the suffering of the others is not simply animal distress, but full human anguish. Whether this was Maria's purpose in caring for them, whether she stayed because she recognized their consciousness, adds another layer to her character that the game never confirms. The long corridor in the Forbidden Woods. The Forbidden Woods is full of pathways that seem to go nowhere. Dead ends, hidden doors, villagers who have been living in isolation long enough to transform in ways distinct from the city above. One corridor leads to a house that contains only a note. The note is from someone who lived there, who retreated there, who apparently knew something was coming. The personalization of the devastation. That real people tried to hide, tried to wait it out, tried to leave records, is done entirely through environmental storytelling in a game full of it. But whose house this is, what the note specifically says, and whether this person survived, as with most of the game's environmental characters, is information Bloodborne never provides. You find the evidence of someone's last attempt to remain human. The name doesn't matter, the silence does. The Cainhurst Nightmare and the Spectre Nights. In Cainhurst Castle, you can hear the sounds of a celebration before you see anyone. Music, distant voices, the sense of a party that is either ongoing or eternally echoing. The Cainhurst Vilebloods who walk the halls are spectral. They are not alive in any ordinary sense, but they maintain the behavior of people in an intact court, patrolling, serving, performing the functions of a castle still operating. Whether this is the moon presence's doing, an effect of Logarius's seal, or something unique to Vileblood blood that resists ordinary death, the game doesn't say. Annalise herself is technically immortal. Whether her court is immortal with her, simply preserved in amber by proximity to her, or whether they are something more like recordings of what they once were, playing out a memory the castle never released. This is the kind of question Bloodborne asks, through chandelier light and footsteps in empty halls. The choir's true ceiling. The upper cathedral ward has a ceiling full of stained glass windows, and through those windows, if you look carefully, you can see stars. Not the usual Bloodborne sky, but a different kind of sky, one that feels further away. The choir built this space to look upward, to orient worship toward the cosmic. The window design is never explained in any item description, but the visual grammar of the space, the flowers turned moonward, the patients transformed into emissaries, the weeping Great One pressed against the wall, suggests the choir believed they were close, that they were on the verge of something. Whether the choir's dissolution and the subsequent collapse of the upper cathedral ward represents failure, or whether the ritual was abandoned before completion, whether they were prevented or simply ran out of time, is something the building embodies and the game never contextualizes. The doll's dream. The doll, when you encounter her at specific moments in the workshop, is sometimes found in different positions, sitting by a candle, standing near the flowers, kneeling at the grave. She does not explain why she moves. She simply is in different places at different times, as if her existence in the dream has its own logic that doesn't correspond to your presence or absence. One reading is that she has her own experience of time in the dream, that when no hunter is present, she lives some private existence the game is too discreet to show you. Another is that the dream simply repositions her. According to some mechanic, the game treats as aesthetic. The difference between those two readings is the difference between the doll being a person and being a beautiful piece of set dressing. The game keeps both possibilities open with absolute care. The Chalice and the Is connection. The Is Chalice dungeons are the deepest level of the labyrinth, older than the Thumerian dungeons, reaching into a space that connects to the sky rather than simply the underground. The sky in Is is purple and cosmic, nothing like the Yharnam above. Ebrietas is found here, in the Is gravestone chalice. The connection between the deepest earth and the furthest sky, the implication that digging deep enough eventually connects you to the same cosmic space as looking up, is one of Bloodborne's most profound architectural ideas. Whether this is metaphor or literal geometry, whether the labyrinth goes so deep it curves back through space, is something the game leaves as an open philosophical question written in level design. The Winter Lantern's gaze. Winter Lanterns are perhaps the most disturbing enemy in Bloodborne. Humanoid figures with grotesquely enlarged heads packed with eyes, who hum to themselves as they walk, and whose gaze triggers instant frenzy if you maintain eye contact with them. The item description for the frenzy status says it is induced by the very presence of a higher being, the cosmos. Looking at a Winter Lantern is looking at a version of what it means to receive insight from a Great One without the capacity to process it. Not enlightenment, but rupture. But who were the Winter Lanterns before this happened to them? They walk the bridges of the nightmare of Menzies. They were presumably Mensis scholars, or Yharnam hunters, or citizens who went too far into the cosmos and came back like this. Whether any awareness survives inside the accumulation of eyes, whether the humming they make is contentment, or the last echo of a person who used to sing, is something the game never clarifies and leaves you to determine by whether you can bring yourself to listen. The missing Carol transcriptions. Carol was the runesmith of Bergenwerth, the person who first transcribed the inhuman voices of the Great Ones into the rune system that hunters can use. The descriptions say these runes are a transcription of the Great One's inhuman voices that ripples like a watery reflection, but the runes in the game represent only a fraction of what the Great Ones must have been saying. Caril heard these voices and translated as many as they could. The implication is that far more was said than was captured, that entire cosmologies, histories, instructions and griefs passed through Caril's perception and were either untranslatable or deliberately withheld. What did the Great Ones say that Caril chose not to transcribe? What was deemed too dangerous or too incomprehensible to render into a form hunters could use? The runes you find in Bloodborne are the fragments of a language, most of which has been lost or hidden. The cosmic lake and its depth. The lake at Bergenwerth is where Master Willem sits, rocking and staring. It is where Rom dwells, maintaining the veil. It is enormous and dark and described in a way that suggests it is connected to a cosmos. Scholars of Byrgenwerth believed the Great Ones had some fundamental relationship to bodies of water, that the sea itself was a medium through which the cosmic could descend. The Scholar Garb item description mentions that the ocean is the true birthplace of the eldritch truth. Whether this is metaphor, ancient belief, or accurate cosmology, whether the water at the base of Byrgenwerth is literally linked to some deeper space, is a question the game plants and waters and never harvests. The hidden altar in the Grand Cathedral. In the base game's Grand Cathedral, after you defeat Vicar Amelia, you can interact with Lawrence's skull on an altar. The altar itself bears a headless female figure pouring a jug of liquid. This iconographic image appears in multiple places across the game whenever Lawrence is referenced. The headless pouring figure is never explained. Is it a symbolic representation of the old blood being given to humanity? A Thumurian religious motif imported into church iconography? A reference to a specific act or person that the game has encoded in stone? The image recurs often enough to be deliberate and persistently enough to be meaningful, and the game never offers a glossary for its own iconography. The abandoned workshop's secret passage. The illusory wall that conceals the abandoned old workshop in the hunter's dream is one of those details that rewards exploration with a question rather than an answer. Hidden inside a stable, quiet dream space is a room full of broken things. The illusory wall suggests someone, or something, wanted this room concealed. From whom? The hunters who visit the dream would have had no reason to hide things from each other. Gehrman is barely mobile. The moon presence presumably knows everything within the dream. The most unsettling interpretation is that the concealment was for the player specifically, that the discovery is meant to function as a revelation, a moment where you understand the dream is not the whole picture, but whether the wall was built by Gehrman, installed by the moon presence, or simply exists as a feature of the dream's architecture, without any deliberate author. The game provides no answer. Eileen's own end. If you fail Eileen the Crow's questline, she ends up dying of her wounds at the entrance to the Grand Cathedral, bleeding out on the steps, having been unable to complete her own task. If you complete it correctly, she disappears from the game entirely. There is no final conversation, no acknowledgement of closure. She simply stops appearing. Eileen came to Yharnam to hunt corrupted hunters. She has been doing this for some time. The game gives no indication of whether she succeeded in whatever she came for, beyond Henrik and the unnamed hunter at the Grand Cathedral, whether she found peace, continued hunting elsewhere, or simply vanished into the night that Yharnam never ends. The game's treatment of Eileen is a masterwork of incompleteness. She does her work, she disappears. The silence that follows her questline says more than any ending cutscene would. The memory gem in the workshop. A small carved item in the abandoned workshop area relates to a specific memory or communication, the kind of object that in another game would provide expository dialogue when examined. In Bloodborne, these items provide a brief fragment of information and leave the rest to inference. The broken doll in the workshop is surrounded by the physical evidence of Gehrman's grief. Half-finished projects, discarded tools, the abandoned evidence of someone who tried to recreate a person and found the result inadequate. Whether this inadequacy drove Gehrman to deeper despair, or whether the inadequacy of the doll was the first signal to him that something beyond human craft would be needed, and thus the beginning of his decision to call out to the moon presence, is an inference the game allows but never confirms. The One Reborn's composition. The One Reborn is the boss you face in Yahar'gul, a mass of decaying bodies fused together, leaking arcane energy, attended by Kime maidens on the platforms above. The description implies this thing is made from the school of Mensis scholars who did not survive the ritual with their individuality intact. Mikolash survived as the host. The others merged into this, but the description of the One Reborn doesn't specifically name the component people. It is called simply the One Reborn, as if plurality has been replaced by singularity, as if the merger is complete enough that they have become something new rather than something composite. Whether any of the original scholars retain any trace of awareness inside this fused mass, and whether Reborn is ironic or sincere in its framing, the game leaves both questions open under the sound of the bells. The presence that watches in Yahar'gul. In Yahar'gul, before the blood moon rises, you may be killed and dragged into the village involuntarily, waking up in a cage, in the dark, with the sound of ringing bells and the sight of things that should not exist assembled in the streets. The game gives you a taste of the village in this passive abduction, before allowing you proper access. This staging, being taken rather than arriving, is a design choice that implies Yahar'gul is a place that takes rather than receives. The bell maidens who ring through the night are summoning, always summoning, drawing hunters into a space that needs them for reasons that are never specified. The village seems to need hunters or victims or witnesses. What the Menses ritual required from these repeated summonings and what Mikolash hoped to gain from the collected presence of hunters dragged into his neighborhood. The game suggests purpose without naming it. The secret behind the stump. Near the beginning of the game, in central Yharnam, there is a large tree stump in the middle of a courtyard. NPCs gather near it. Blood pools around it. It functions as environmental atmosphere. But the stump is enormous, suggesting a tree of significant size once occupied this space. And in a city built around blood and cosmic horror, the presence or absence of a massive tree is not incidental. Some community scholars have drawn connections between this stump and the great tree in the hunter's dream, the pale tree under which Gehrman sits. Both are central to their spaces. Both are associated with waiting and with endings. Whether they were once connected, whether the tree in the waking world and the tree in the dream are related, or whether the visual echo is simply aesthetic. The game lets the two images mirror each other without explaining the relationship. The shadows of Yharnam and their candles. The shadows of Yharnam are a trio of boss enemies found in the forest area before Byrgenwerth. They are robed, masked figures who carry candles and snakes and fight with a combination of blade work and arcane techniques. Their description says they guard the secrets of Byrgenwerth. But specifically, they guard the path to Byrgenwerth from Cainhurst, the path the Vilbloods might take. Whether these are former Byrgenwerth students or Pthemerian guardians or something the school summoned specifically to protect themselves from the Cainhurst heresy is entirely unclear. The snakes they carry and control suggest a different tradition than the main game's imagery. Snakes do not appear elsewhere in Bloodborne's iconography. What tradition the shadows represent, where they came from, and why Byrgenwerth needed them specifically against Cainhurst rather than against anyone else. These questions hang around them like smoke. The mournful cries of Murgo. After the death of Murgo's wet nurse, the crying of Murgo continues for several seconds before stopping. The game does not explain this. the nightmare is slain when the crying stops. Whether Murgo died, returned to a realm beyond the nightmare, or was simply no longer manifest in the dream world, the cessation of that cry is the game's only punctuation for what happens to a formless infant Great One when its nightmare falls. Woof. The sound design of this moment, the crying quieting into silence, is one of the most carefully considered emotional beats in the game. It asked you to feel something for a being you never saw, for a child who was born into a prison, built from the suffering of those who tried to use it as a tool. What mercy Murgo's release represents, and whether it is release or simply dissolution. The game ends the nightmare and leaves the rest unsaid. The smell of the hunter's dream. This is not a mystery that can be found in an item description, but the hunter's dream, as a space, contains elements that seem designed to evoke something specific. Lumen flowers, a warm light, a quiet workshop, a garden without wind. It is peaceful in a game of relentless violence. The peace is constructed, Gehrman's memory given form by the moon presence's power. But whose memory specifically? The dream reflects Gehrman's losses. The doll, the workshop, the flowers Maria loved. The entirety of the hunter's dream is a monument to grief made liveable. Whether the comfort it offers you as a hunter is genuine or a manipulation. Whether the moon presence designed the dream to feel like safety specifically to keep hunters willing to return to it is a question the game encodes in every lantern. The source of the amygdalae. The amygdalae are the massive tentacled entities that cling to Yharnam's buildings and walls, invisible until you have enough insight to see them. Their description says they are feared and loathed, but also implies they have a specific cosmic function. The name connects to the brain's amygdala, the center of emotional response and fear processing. The amygdalae seem to be tethered to Yharnam in service of something, or they have simply aggregated here because the cosmic activity in the city attracts them. One very specific amygdala carries you to Canehurst when you present the summons. She reaches down from the sky and teleports you. This implies some amygdalae are more active, more purposeful than others. Whether they arrived with the moon presence, whether they are connected to Udin's blood essence, or whether they simply exist at the edges of human perception across all of Bloodborne's world. The game offers the detail without the context. Archibald and the lightning experiments. Archibald was an eccentric scholar of the Healing Church who studied the electrifying discharges of the dark beast Parl and used that research to develop the Tonitrus and bolt paper. His description says the church considered his work dubious but fascinating. Dark beast Parl's exact nature is itself debated. The creature is categorized as a dark beast, associated with lightning in ways that suggest something beyond ordinary beast transformation. But the game never explicitly names Parl a Great One. Whether the lightning that runs through Parl is a cosmic property, the result of Archibald's experiments being conducted on a living subject, or something the creature developed independently, the game leaves all of this ambiguous. Parl is imprisoned in the hypogam beneath Yahar'gul, the district the School of Mensis controlled, which suggests someone put Parl there and kept it. Whether it was Archibald studying his subject, Mensis containing a dangerous result of that study, or something else entirely. The game places Parl in a cell and Archibald in footnotes and leaves the connection for you to draw. The Child of Blood and its destiny. Queen Annalise has been collecting blood dregs for what may be centuries, all in service of eventually birthing the Child of Blood, the next heir of the vile blood line. But what would the Child of Blood actually be? The game describes the vile blood as containing something forbidden, something that predates the Church's framework for understanding blood. The scholar who brought it to Cainhurst did so from Bergenwerth, which means the forbidden blood was either old blood from the Pthumerian labyrinths or something even stranger. If the child of blood were ever born, if Annalise's patient accumulation ever reached fulfillment, would it be a human heir, a great one, a hybrid? The description of what Annalise is hoping for is absent from the game's text. She simply waits. The blood dregs accumulate. The child remains unborn. The foreign garb and what it hides. The item description for the foreign garb, the outfit your hunter wears at the very beginning of the game, says it is not typical clothing for Yharnam. Perhaps it is of foreign origin. It is said the traveller came to Yharnam from afar. Without memory, who will ever know? The phrase, "it is said," is interesting. This description was not written by the hunter. It was written by someone else, observing the hunter from outside. Someone within Yharnam knows enough about the hunter to write an item description about them, but that knowledge extends only to the surface, the clothing, the implication of foreign origin, the convenient erasure of memory. Whether the person who wrote this description knew more about the hunter than they chose to record, or whether the memory erasure was so complete that even the people who witnessed the transfusion couldn't access what came before, is one of those small, persistent ambiguities the game seeds everywhere. The Nightmare Apostles and their waiting. In the Nightmare of Mensis, there are robed figures called Nightmare Apostles, spidery, crawling things that move across ceilings and walls and attack with long-limbed, scrambling violence. They are associated with the spider, with Mensis's connection to the spider motif that runs through the game's cosmic imagery. But the description of the Nightmare Apostles says they serve the Nightmare's will. Whose will? Mikolash's? Murgo's? The Nightmare's own emergent logic, if it has one. The game populates the Nightmare with servants of something, but never specifies the chain of command. The Apostles may be transformed scholars, transformed hunters, or creatures generated by the Nightmare itself. What they serve, and why, is something the game leaves in the architecture of the Nightmare, rather than in any text. The hole in the Great Bridge. In central Yharnam, the Great Bridge is where the cleric beast walks. But beneath the bridge, accessible through a series of ladders and drops, there is a section of the sewers and lower Yharnam that contains secrets the game does not highlight. Specifically, there are items and enemies placed with a specificity that implies this space was used for something, had a population, served a function in Yharnam's daily or ritual life. The underground geography of Yharnam is extensive and intentional. Not just environmental dressing, but evidence of a city whose vertical complexity extended downward as much as upward. What happened in the spaces beneath Yharnam that the streets above never acknowledged? Whether the church used these spaces, whether the residents did, or whether they were simply where the most desperate people went when the upper city became uninhabitable, is written into the architecture and never into any text. The last beacon of the dream. In the hunter's dream, there is a lantern at the end of the garden path. It is not a lamp you can use to fast travel. It simply exists there, burning, at the edge of the dream space, past German and the tree and the graves. No item description explains it. No NPC mentions it. It is simply a lit beacon at the far edge of a dream, suggesting a direction beyond the dream's visible boundary that is never reached. Whether this is an artifact of level design, a visual detail meant to convey the sense of infinite space beyond the dream, or something that has a specific in-universe meaning. The game plants a light in the dark and trusts you to notice it, and not ask what it means. The fourth ending. Bloodborne has 3 endings. Gehrman's Mercy, the Moon Presence's Binding, the Hunter's Ascension to Great One. Each one is a completed arc, but the community has long noted that the Childhood's Beginning ending, in which you become an infant Great One, is presented with enormous ambiguity. You are cradled by the doll. The game implies this is a liberation, but an infant Great One is still at the beginning of something. The doll holds you in the final image, and her expression is difficult to read. Tenderness, or grief, or something the human face was not designed to express. Is the transformed hunter free? Are they the next moon presence? Are they Gehrman's replacement, or Gehrman's redemption, or something entirely beyond the cycle that trapped him? The ending is called Childhood's Beginning. Not a triumph, not a conclusion, but a beginning. What that beginning leads to is something even Yharnam cannot answer. The source of insight. Insight is the game's currency for madness and perception. The more you have, the more you see. The amygdalae become visible. The doll becomes real. Gehrman becomes more present in the dream. But insight is gained by encountering bosses for the first time, by consuming Madman's knowledge and similar items, by using the cord of the eye. What exactly is being accumulated? The game calls it eyes on the inside, the same phrase Mikolash uses when he begs for Grant to bestow them. The more insight you carry, the more real the cosmic horror becomes. At very high insight, enemies may behave differently, and the world acquires a different texture. Whether insight is a measure of accumulated trauma, genuine expanded perception, or both, and whether the eyes on the inside metaphor is literal in Bloodborne's universe, is one of the game's most consistently fascinating open questions. The note left in the dream. There is a note near the beginning of the game that says, "To escape this dreadful hunter's dream, hold the source of the spreading scourge of beasts, lest the night carry on forever." This note was presumably left by a previous hunter. The instruction it gives is accurate. Stop the scourge, end the night. But hold the source is interesting. The source of the scourge is the old blood, which is ineradicably part of the city. No hunter could literally halt it. The most the hunter can accomplish is to end the specific ritual cycle driving the blood moon, which is what defeating Murgo achieves. Whether the note was left by Gehrman, by a previous hunter who came close to understanding, or by someone still further back in the dream's history, and whether the writer of this note succeeded or failed, is something the game keeps inside the note's brevity. The heart of Yharnam. Yharnam is described as a city famous for blood ministration, a place people travel to seeking cures. But the city exists on top of layered history, the Pythagorean labyrinths, the sleeping great ones, the accumulated centuries of blood use and experiment and tragedy. The game shows you this stratification through its world design. The surface city, then the sewers, then the dungeons, then the labyrinth, then the cosmic spaces beneath and above. Whether this vertical structure is geographical or metaphorical, whether the city sits on its own trauma literally, and whether anything at the very center of Yharnam is still intact, or whether the heart of it was always the blood that moved through everyone and everything, is a question the game poses through its own structure without ever making it explicit. What remains when the hunt ends? At the end of any Bloodborne playthrough, the blood moon sets or is extinguished. The sun rises over Yharnam. Gehrman says it is under the morning sun that you will be freed. But Yharnam is destroyed. The citizens are beasts or dead. The great ones have either been killed or have retreated. The healing church is gone. The school of Mensis is gone. The workshop is still there in a dream, with an old man's memory animating it. What remains of Yharnam after a night like this? Not the city, not the people, maybe the buildings, if the Blood Moon's departure didn't consume them too. The game asks you to end the night and never asks you to consider what you are ending it for. The silence after the hunt, the morning that follows the ceremony of violence, is the game's final unanswered question. You succeeded. You hunted. The night ended. But there is no Yharnam to wake up in. The Tomb of Uden's original function. The Tomb of Uden is where you fight Father Gascoigne. A graveyard surrounding what appears to be a small chapel structure, tucked beneath the towering city above. The name is significant. In Yharnam, naming a graveyard after Uden is not metaphorical. The Carol rune for formless Uden drops from the Uden chapel dweller, the deranged priest who serves the chapel above. And the connection between the graveyard and the chapel suggests a layered relationship between the location of worship and the location of the dead. But the original function of the Tomb of Eden, whether it was designed specifically as a burial ground for Uden's worshippers, or whether it predates the chapel, or whether the chapel was built above a site that was already considered sacred because of the graves, is never discussed. The small door that connects the tomb to the church district is one of the oldest architectural features in central Yharnam. Whatever ceremony once took place at the border between those two spaces is something the city has forgotten how to name. The three pigs of central Yharnam. There are large pigs wandering central Yharnam, enormous beasts that are clearly animal rather than human in origin, yet have been transformed by the scourge into something that now carries beast pellets and item drops, suggesting they have consumed enough human remains to be considered part of the beast ecology. They are not central to any quest line. They have no item descriptions uniquely their own. They exist in central Yharnam as evidence that the scourge does not restrict itself to humans. Animals in Yharnam, pigs, crows, the dogs in cages, exist in a world saturated by old blood, and their transformations run alongside the human ones without receiving the same attention. Whether the animals of Yharnam were used experimentally, whether they contracted the scourge through proximity or through the city's water supply, and whether their transformations parallel human transformation in any meaningful way. The game places them in the streets and allows you to either kill them or read them as part of the world's texture. The rune that has no name. Among the Carol runes available in the game, there are several that describe their origins clearly. Transcriptions of Great One voices, inscriptions discovered in labyrinths. But one rune, Deep Sea, describes simply the deep sea and the wisdom hidden in the depths, without connecting it to any specific Great One, any specific location, or any documented discovery. It was transcribed. Someone heard something and wrote it down. But the author of this particular rune, what they heard and where, and what the deep sea represents in Bloodborne's cosmology, beyond the suggestion that water connects to cosmic truth, these are never addressed. It is one of the game's minor mysteries, easily missed, but the same careful intentionality that governs everything in Bloodborne's text applies equally to a rune whose origin remains unattributed. The Annalise condition. Annalise is described as undying. She cannot be permanently killed by conventional means. If Alfred murders her with the wheel, you can restore her through a ritual item found in the Forbidden Woods. Her immortality is connected to vile blood physiology, to what the forbidden blood does to a body when it is made into the bedrock of a dynasty. But the game never explains what it costs Annalise to be undying. undying in Bloodborne usually comes with a price: Gehrman's imprisonment, the eternal suffering of the hunters in the nightmare. Annalise simply exists, patient, eternal, waiting for the blood dregs to accumulate and for a child to be born. Whether her immortality is a power, a curse, or simply a fact of what vile blood does when concentrated enough is never addressed. She accepts it as her condition without apparent anguish, which either means she is at peace with it or that she no longer experiences anything that resembles anguish. The lamp between the worlds. Every lamp in Bloodborne serves as a link to the hunter's dream, a point of connection between the waking world and the dream. The messengers appear at lamps. The dream is accessed through them, but the lamps are distributed throughout Yharnam in a way that implies someone placed them, that the network was designed. In the earliest parts of the game, lamps appear in locations that would have been important even before the current night of the hunt. The implication that the lamp network predates the current crisis, that Gehrman, or the Moon Presence, or the original workshop arranged these connection points across Yharnam specifically, is present in the infrastructure without being explained. Who placed the first lamp? When? And whether the placement was practical, or whether each lamp represents a specific memory or meaning that only Gehrman would recognize. The network of golden lights is one of Bloodborne's most thoroughly functional and most thoroughly unexplained mysteries. The graveyard by the workshop. In the hunter's dream, past Gehrman's workshop and the flowers, there is a graveyard, headstones, multiple graves. The dream is built from Gehrman's memory and from the Moon Presence's construction of a space for hunters. So the graves either represent specific people Gehrman lost, or they are decorative features of a dream space designed to convey the weight of the hunt, or they serve some structural function the game never names. The doll prays at one of them, Maria's, most believe. But there are many more graves than there are named dead people in the immediate story. Whether each grave belongs to a hunter who passed through the dream and was released by Gehrman, whether they represent the workshop hunters who died in the fishing hamlet, or whether they are simply the dream's way of depicting the cumulative grief of a man who has been keeping this vigil for centuries. The graveyard exists as an image that the game trusts you to stand in front of and feel. The Bloodting economy. Bloodting is a stat in Bloodborne that governs the power of blood-based attacks, most notably the Chikage, a blade that can be drenched in the user's own blood to deliver corrosive strikes, and the Evelyn and various other firearms that shoot blood rather than conventional projectiles, but the Lore of Bloodborne, what it means to have a high affinity for one's own blood as a weapon, connects to the vile blood tradition and to the nature of blood as sacred substance. Some characters, like Ariana, have blood that is intrinsically more valuable or potent. The idea that blood could be both a weapon and a gift, both corrosive and healing depending on its source, is woven through the game's systems without ever being explained in dialogue. Whether Bloodting hunters are more susceptible to the scourge, whether their relationship to blood is a form of worship or simply a skill, and whether the Healing Church considered them heretical by analogy to the Vile Bloods. These connections exist in the game's mechanical vocabulary and remain unaddressed in its text. The choir's final experiment. If you look closely at the upper cathedral ward, specifically at the wing that leads to Ebrietas, the physical evidence of experiments that were conducted here is everywhere. Celestial emissaries walk peacefully until disturbed. The living failures are a locked-away result. Ebrietas herself weeps at the wall of an otherwise ordinary boss room. But there is also the implication of something that was attempted and not completed. One final experiment that the choir was conducting when everything collapsed. The abandoned workshop equivalent for the choir is the upper cathedral ward itself, a space frozen at the moment of its abandonment. Whatever the choir was building toward, whatever the culmination of the lumen flower rituals and the Ebrietas experiments would have produced if the city had not fallen, that is a future Bloodborne withholds from you, not because it doesn't exist in theory, but because history swallowed it. The terrible old man. Old Yharnam is inhabited by a survivor, Jura, and his allies from the powder kegs. But before you reach Jura's tower, you pass through streets full of beasts and the remnants of a community that was burned and never rebuilt. Among the items you can find in Old Yharnam are clues to what this neighborhood was before the fire. A merchant district, a residential area, a community with its own shops and homes and daily life. The fire that consumed it was part of the church's response to the ash and blood epidemic. Every building that still stands in Old Yharnam is a building that was supposed to burn. Every beast you kill there was a person the church decided it was acceptable to lose. The weight of that decision, made by people who are themselves now dead or transformed or trapped in nightmares, rests in every square inch of a neighborhood that exists only as evidence, the connection between Blood Moon and Beast Scourge. A lore note found in the game says, "When the red moon hangs low, the line between man and beast is blurred, and when the great ones descend, a womb will be blessed with child." The Blood Moon's relationship to the Scourge of Beasts is implied to be causal. Either the moon causes the transformation, or the transformations cause the moon, or both are symptoms of the same underlying cosmic event. The blood moon rises in the middle of the game as a direct consequence of Mensis's ritual success. But the scourge predates this specific blood moon. It has been spreading for years before the night of the hunt begins. Whether the blood moon is an ambient feature of Yharnam's existence, always present at a certain depth of corruption, or whether it was triggered specifically by the Mensis ritual and represents something new. The game's note connects moon and beast and child in a sequence it never fully unpacks. The missing choir members. The choir occupied the upper cathedral ward, but the only choir members you encounter are the living failures, the celestial emissaries, and Ebrietas. All transformations, all end states. No choir member speaks to you. No choir member survives with their identity intact. The entirety of the choir's human membership was either consumed by transformation or killed by the same collapse that ended everything in the upper ward. Whether any choir member understood what they had become, whether any of them considered their transformation a success or a failure before losing the capacity to judge it, and whether the highest-ranking members of the choir were the first to be transformed or the last, none of this survives them. The secret origin of trick weapons. Trick weapons. The transforming, collapsible, highly engineered weapons that define Bloodborne's combat are described as inventions of the workshop, the organization Gehrman founded. The saw weapons, the bladed weapons, the whips that become staffs and the axes that become polearms. All of these were developed by hunters who needed tools adaptable enough for both human-scale and beast-scale combat. But the specific inventors of most trick weapons are not named. The burial blade, Gehrman's own weapon, was made by Gehrman. The Rakyo was Maria's. But who made the Kirkhammer, or the threaded cane, or the hunter's axe? The workshop apparently had craftspeople whose identities have been entirely absorbed into the tools they left behind. The workshop tradition created an entire material culture and then vanished, leaving only the weapons. each one a record of a mind that understood something specific about violence and beauty, and the need for both at once. The true extent of the scourge. The scourge of beasts originated in Old Yharnam, with the ashen blood and the old blood response that accelerated it. But the game's references to the scourge always treat it as a Yharnam problem. Other cities, other places, the world beyond Yharnam, are never addressed in terms of whether the beast plague has spread. You came to Yharnam from somewhere. Gilbert came from somewhere. Other hunters came from elsewhere. Whatever world exists beyond the city limits of Yharnam is entirely invisible in the game's text and geography. Whether the scourge is contained by the city's isolation, whether the healing church's monopoly on blood ministration has prevented its spread, or whether the world outside Yharnam already knows and is dealing with its own version of the same thing. The game keeps its horizon deliberately close and never lets you see beyond it. Parl's remaining self. Dark Beast Parl is imprisoned in the Hippogem beneath Yahar'gul. He is a Great One, or something that has become adjacent to a Great One through experiment and exposure. The lightning that runs through him is not natural. It was something Archibald studied and tried to replicate. Parl's imprisonment beneath the city Mensis controlled suggests the school of Mensis was aware of Parl's existence and kept him contained, either out of fear or out of ongoing study. But whether Parl was always a beast, whether he was once a person or a Great One who was changed into this form, and whether the lightning in him is a cosmic property or the result of what Archibald's experiments did to his biology. The game leaves all of these questions in the dark below the streets, where no one goes anymore. The hunter who left the note. If the Japanese context is accurate, and the note in Iosefka's clinic was written by the hunter themselves, then there is a version of the hunter's story that exists before the memory erasure. A version in which the hunter came to Yharnam, not out of desperation, but out of specific knowledge, in which the blood transfusion was not a hopeful shot in the dark, but a deliberate sacrifice of one's own past in service of a mission. The hunter chose to forget. The note is the breadcrumb they left themselves. Whether this reading is correct depends on a piece of Japanese localization context that the English version softens, and the game itself never confirms or denies the full implication. But if it is true, then the hunter is not a victim of the blood, but a volunteer. And everything about the journey through Yharnam takes on a different weight when you consider that someone who knew exactly what was coming decided to walk into it anyway. The bloodless bodies in the workshop, in the abandoned old workshop, alongside the broken doll and the fragments of Gehrman's grief, there are bloodstains on the floor, the kind you might find in a space where medical work was done, or where something was made that required fluid. The workshop created weapons. The workshop used blood to enhance those weapons, but blood enhancement, as described in the item descriptions, requires old blood, specifically. That Gehrman was working with old blood in the original workshop, in the same space where the umbilical cord relating to the moon presence was eventually found, raises the question of what exactly he was doing there before the moon presence arrived. The bloodstains in an abandoned room are the most concrete evidence of activity and the most completely uncontextualized piece of evidence in the entire dream. The silence after Gascoigne. Father Gascoigne is described as an outsider, not a native of Yharnam like the player's hunter, but someone who came from elsewhere and stayed for the hunt. The Gehrman description of Gascoigne after you kill him is, "The moon is close. It will be a long hunt tonight." He says this as if Gascoigne's death is simply a detail in a longer night. But Gascoigne's questline, the music box, the daughter, the wife already dead, the hunter already too far gone, is the game's most personal tragedy, and its resolution is abrupt. Gascoigne's name, the origin country he came from, what drew him to Yharnam initially, and what the specific trigger was that accelerated his transformation on this particular night. None of these are addressed in any item description or NPC dialogue. He is present at the exact moment of his breaking and gone the moment you move past him, and the family he left behind follows him into the dark. The spider motif and its meaning. Spiders appear throughout Bloodborne's cosmology. Rom, the vacuous spider, the nightmare apostles, Patches the spider enemies in the Chalice dungeons. The spider motif seems to connect to the idea of the web, of something that traps, that entangles, that creates structures that catch things passing through. Rom maintains a veil. Nightmare apostles serve the nightmare's logic. The spider imagery clusters around the idea of things that should not be seen, things that are hidden, things that wait behind concealment. Whether this thematic coherence is fully deliberate, whether the spiders in Bloodborne represent a single idea about the nature of cosmic concealment and the protection of terrible secrets, or whether the motif simply accumulated organically from Miyazaki's imagery choices, the result is a game in which spiders appear everywhere that something is being kept from sight. The enduring question of the Scourge's source. At the very bottom of the game's lore, beneath the healing church and Byrgenwerth and the fishing hamlet and the Pthumerian queens, is a question the game never answers. Why did the old blood have the power to corrupt? What made the blood of the Great Ones, a substance so sacred that civilizations were built to guard it, so healing that it attracted pilgrims from across the world, also a vector for transformation into beasts? Whether the corruption was always present in the blood and the Pthumerians knew it and used it anyway, whether it was introduced by some process in the labyrinths, or by the specific Great Ones who were sleeping there, or whether the corruption is simply an intrinsic property of cosmic substance interacting with human biology. The game places the question at every level of its world and never assigns it an answer. The Scourge of Beasts is the consequence of everything Yharnam did. What made it possible is the question Yharnam never asked.